So many people think that if they start a podcast, a YouTube channel, or post on Instagram for 90 days, that they will grow a massive following. And while it's not impossible to do, not many people have grown a massive following in a short amount of time. And that is because it takes years to build a brand, especially if you're just now getting started on social media. It's no secret that podcasts are one of the most consumed forms of content. And in today's video, I want to walk you through how you can sell your brand with a podcast and how you can grow an audience into customers. So step number one is to design a podcast framework. And in this podcast framework, you must start by answering the question, what are your goals? Why are you starting a podcast? What are your goals for this podcast? Once you know and understand what your goal is for yourself and for this podcast, you must look into doing some market research so that you can define the niche and the cohort that you need to dive into. And when it comes to doing market research and defining your niche, looking at cohorts and customer segmentation, the more specific that you can get, the better. Once you've done some market research and you understand who your target audience is and who your customers will be, you need to pick a name for your podcast. Pick something that resonates with yourself and that also fits in and resonates with your audience. And after you pick a name, I suggest that you go on a name checker to verify that your name can be used on social media platforms as well as for the podcast. The second step in starting your podcast is your shooting style. What do you want the shooting style of your podcast to be? Is it going to be a co-host podcast? Will it be an educational podcast? Will it be a scripted podcast? Or will it be a news and events recap podcast? Depending on which podcast shooting style you choose, I recommend that you shoot anywhere between 20 to 40 minutes. This is typically the sweet spot for podcast listeners. And now that you've designed a podcast framework and you know what your shooting style is going to be for the podcast, you need to set up the proper equipment. And starting with setting up your equipment, you need to know how many people will be on your podcast. Will it be just you by yourself? Will it be 2 people in a conversation? Will it be 3 people doing interview style? Do you need to have a table in the center of 2 people with 2 microphones? Do you want to have a wide angle podcast with standalone mics for each person? Or do you like to have the more casual, comforting style of sitting on a couch and having the handheld mics? And once you understand how many people will be on your podcast, you will know how many microphones you need to get. And when it comes to microphones, there are different types and different styles. The one I'm speaking into is a condenser microphone using an XLR cable. There are also dynamic microphones that also take an XLR, and then there are condenser microphones that take a USB directly into the computer. Once you get a microphone, you need something to hold that microphone, whether it's a stand, a boom arm, anything that you can use that will hold the microphone in the position for you to be able to speak directly into it. And if you're using a microphone that has an XLR output, then you will also need to get an audio interface. And I will have links in the description of all of the equipment that I'm mentioning in this video. And next you will need to determine where you will shoot the podcast. A studio, an office space, an open area. And after you choose a space for the podcast, you may need some sound treatment if there isn't a lot in the room and if the sound seems like it just bounces around off the walls. I recommend using some acoustic panels that you can put on the walls to dampen the sound. And I'll leave that in the link in the description as well. Now, one thing that I always recommend for podcasting is that you never do just an audio podcast. You shoot it on video as well, whether that is professionally done on a nice camera or even if you start on just using your phone. There are multiple different options for cameras that you can go out and get, from small end to high end production cameras, but you can also get by with just starting on your phone and getting comfortable with shooting podcasts consistently before you upgrade and get to that production equipment. If you do choose to get a camera to shoot your podcast on, whether you shoot a podcast on a nice camera or even just on your phone, you'll need a tripod so that you can sit it in front of you. And once you know what all of your equipment is going to be for your podcast, you need to determine an audio recording software. There are softwares like Hindenburg Pro, GarageBand, and what this does is it allows you to record your audio from your microphone into a computer and edit it through the software so that your audio sounds clear and concise. And now that you have everything set up, you know what your podcast is going to look like, you know who you're targeting, you've got all the equipment in place, and you know where you're shooting, you need to record a podcast trailer. This is where you shoot an intro and an outro to your podcast that I'm sure you've heard on many podcasts before. Everyone's got their own unique intro to their podcast, so make yours suitable to your audience, but also something that is specific to you. Once you've recorded your intro and your outro, you're ready to shoot your first podcast. Now, for each podcast, I recommend that you write an outline so that you can have an idea of what you're going to talk about and what specific events. Now, when it comes to preparing for your podcast, I recommend that you write an outline for each one so that you know what you're going to talk about and so that you can have specific points or topics that you could touch on. This outline will also help you whenever it comes to uploading your podcast and having to write a description or show notes. And before you ever shoot your first podcast, I would run a test track to make sure that your audio and your visual is working the way that you want it to. Once you've shot your first episode of your podcast, you will need to name that podcast. Or do you want to pick something that is unique to that specific podcast and title it that? Two things that I recommend when you're just getting started into podcasting is to shoot the visual on your phone and to shoot the audio through a USB microphone that goes directly into your computer. And then I recommend editing everything in Premiere Pro. Premiere Pro allows you to edit the audio and the visual together so that you can make one cohesive video. And once you've edited and completed your first podcast, you will need to have podcast artwork so that you can upload it to each specific site. Your podcast artwork is essentially your thumbnail that will show whenever people click on your overall podcast. You don't really want your podcast artwork to have too many words or too much going on unless that's just really the theme of your brand. But you want it to be simple and eye-catching for people so that while they're scrolling through podcasts, yours sticks out. And the next step is to set up podcast hosting. I recommend using Buzzsprout because it is very inexpensive for what you get out of it, and it also has a feature called Co-Host AI, which will generate episode names and episode descriptions for you. Now that you've shot and edited your first podcast and you're set up on a podcast hosting site, it's time to get listed on podcast directories. Now, podcast directories are Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, Alexa, and so many others. The podcast directory is the platform that will publish your podcast. And once you're listed on a podcast directory, your next step is to grow your podcast and grow your audience. Choose when you will publish your podcast and be consistent with it. If it's every other day, if it's every week, if it's bi-weekly, if it's once a month, whatever it is that you choose to shoot and edit your podcast and post it, be consistent with the process. I always recommend using social media to build hype for your first podcast. Let people know that you're shooting a podcast and bring them in on the process. People love something that's new and exciting. And once you've built hype and you've posted your first podcast, share it across all social media accounts. Stay consistent with looking at the comments, reaching out to people who follow, who like, and diving into your customer audience so that you can become interactive with the people who are watching your podcast. Growing your audience takes consistency from you in posting and consistency from you in reaching out and connecting with them in various ways. And these are all of the steps that you can use to sell your brand with a podcast. If you learned something from this video, hit the like and the subscribe button down below and hit the notification bell to be notified anytime that I release a new video. And if you want to sell more than just your brand, then watch my next video on selling anything using persuasion. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.